Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our third Zoom session. Just as a reminder, we do not have a Zoom session next Wednesday due to the Juneteenth holiday. So we have class tonight, no class next Wednesday, and then we'll have two then final classes, one on the 26th and then one on July 3rd, and then that wraps up our summer term together. So since next week is Juneteenth, your Canvas essay number 3, in which you will be talking about some of the examples of classical theorists like Weber and Taylor in your chosen organization. That will then be due on the 20th. So that'll be due next Thursday because they didn't want to have an assignment due on the holiday. So the Canvas essay number 3 with your 2 responses to classmates will then be due next Thursday on June 20th. So where we currently are now in the class is our last time that we were together. We talked about the classical theorists. We started our movement into neoclassical theory as well by talking about human relations theory. And so what we're going to do tonight is we're going to keep our discussion of the evolution of organization theory literature going by moving into another neoclassical theory, which is modern human resource management theory. We'll do that in the first part of class, and then we'll talk about motivational theories, which really serve very much of an offshoot of human resource management theory and kind of a refinement of human resource management theory. So we'll do motivational theories, and then we'll see how we're doing on time. If we have time left, I do have a breakout room exercise that we can do, but we'll kind of play it by ear and see how we're doing in terms of time. Because last week I had good connectivity without my camera on. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off just to make sure that I can save a little bit on our bandwidth so we don't have any internet connection problems this evening. So that's where we currently are. Then we'll be off next week for Juneteenth. And then on the 26th, when we come back together again, we will talk about systems theory and we'll move into some of the more modern theories of studying organizations. So we'll talk about things such as organization culture, quality management, participative management, leadership theories, and kind of reorient ourselves to where the literature currently is now and how the modern literature really does view modern day public organizations. And then on our last night together on July 3rd, we'll reserve that time then for the presentations of your organizational analysis papers. Again, just to reiterate, if I know July 3rd is the day before July 4th, I can kind of do that math. And so I know that it's kind of awkward to have a class on July 3rd, but we kind of have to, or else we're going to run out of time together. So if for some reason you're not going to be able to be in attendance at that July 3rd session, you need to do your presentation on June 26th. That's absolutely fine, but please do send me an email between now and the 26th and let me know that you'd like to do your presentation on the 26th, and then I'm sure that we can accommodate that if necessary. Okay. So that's where we've been. This is where we are, and then that's where we're going for the remainder of our very brief term together here in summer session 1. All right. Any questions or anything at all before we get into our discussion of human resource management theory? So I think where we left off the story last week is we left off the story talking about our transition away from the classical theorists like Max Weber and Frederick Taylor and the principal theorists like Henri Fayolle and Mooney and Gulick, and talked about some of the limitations and some of the criticisms associated with the classical school and how those limitations and criticisms then launched another school of thought known as the human relations school. And we began that discussion with kind of our pre-human relations theorist, which was Mary Parker Follett. We talked about her theory of democratic organizations and how those democratic organizations are really predicated upon providing avenues for participation on the part of our employees. We said that we called her a pre-human relations theorist because she really was writing before a lot of the other human relations theorists, and she was writing primarily in the early 1900s and the 1920s at the very heyday of scientific management. But Follett developed a lot of her theories as a response to the criticisms associated with the classical theory of like scientific management. Primarily the criticism that scientific management was dehumanizing and really didn't pay much attention to individual employees and to treat individual employees as different, distinct human beings. So we said Mary Parker Follett did a lot of her work there in the 1920s, combating the movement towards scientific management. And then we identified people like Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger, who, writing a decade or two later, picked up on many of the same themes that Follett had talked about in terms of recognizing organizations as social systems. And then Mayo and Roethlisberger argued to us that organizations have social components to them. If we only focus on the technical components of how the work gets done or how to structure the organization, like the classical theorists, then we're going to miss out on a lot of those social dynamics. And so once you start viewing an organization as a social system, you are then inherently starting to pay attention to the individual human beings who populate that social system and recognizing that those individual human employees, they have their own sets of wants and needs, and those sets of wants and needs may be distinct between those different employees. We also talked about somebody like Chester Barnard in human relations theory, who talked about the need for effective leaders and managers to gain the compliance, the acquiescence of their employees. That's not good enough for a leader or manager to just simply tell an employee, this is what you need to do, and expect them to do it. That top-down command and control for Barnard was not sufficient. And instead, what you need to do is your success as a leader or manager and the success of your organization is very much based upon getting the compliance of your employees. So Barnard told us all about this transactional relationship that goes on between leaders and their employees. Leaders provide incentives, and then those incentives will then induce employees to provide contributions to the organization. But it is very much this transactional type of relationship where at the end of the day, for all the human relations theorists, the ultimate goal of human relations theory is to accomplish the goals of the organization. Their ultimate goal will be organizational effectiveness, but then how you treat individual employees can then contribute to the achievement of that organizational effectiveness. So when you're paying attention to individual employees, when you're asking them about their wants and their needs and recognizing differences between them, you are doing that for the purpose of benefiting the organization. So the ultimate goal is still an organization, a macro level type of goal, as opposed to the individual goals, the micro level goals of each individual employee. That focus on the organization as opposed to the wants and needs of the individual employees. That was seen by some authors as being a problem with the human relations theorists. People in what became known as the human resource management school viewed human relations theory as being somewhat exploitative. That, with Chester Barnard, you're saying we're going to provide these incentives, but we're doing it so that we can elicit contributions from these employees. When you're engaging in that type of a transaction, there is an exploitative type of component to it because you're not trying to pay attention to what people want and need because of the value of those individuals, but rather you're doing it based upon what you can then extract from them in terms of contributions. And indeed, Barnard tells us that organizational efficiency is really very much based upon this balance between the contributions we're able to extract from employees and the dissatisfaction that those employees are going to feel because of this transactional relationship. But the ultimate goal is still to benefit the organization. So modern human resource management theorists, instead of just asking the simple question of what can employees do for the organization, we now have human resource management theorists asking the question, what can the organization do for individual employees? And so they're now creating this two-way street. Not only what can the individual give to the organization, but what can the organization then do to benefit the individual employee? and to help that individual develop as a human resource, help them develop their skills and their abilities, their supervisory abilities. And if they take these skills that they develop in the organization and they then leave the organization and they take those skills elsewhere, there is still an inherent value to helping those people develop as human resources. It's not all about what they can give back to their organization. So it's kind of like this, turn of phrase of the old Kennedy quote about, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Well, it's asked just not what the individual can do for the organization, but what can the organization do for the individual employee. So the common theme we're seeing in this evolution of organization theory literature is that new schools of thought are developed as rejoinders, as responses to some of the flaws and perceived criticisms of earlier schools. And so the modern school of human resource management developed because of those criticisms of human relations school. So one of the first authors we talk about when we talk about human resource management theory is Abraham Maslow. And you've run into Abraham Maslow, I'm sure, before in some other courses. If you've taken psychology courses, you've probably talked at length about Abraham Maslow and what he calls his hierarchy of needs. The idea with Maslow is that every employee has their own hierarchy of needs. And as reflected on the screen, the pyramid there is this hierarchy of needs. At the bottom of the hierarchy, typically you have physiological needs. So needs such as a need for food, water, warmth, rest. Those are your physiological needs. Above that, you have your safety needs, the need for human beings to feel secure and to feel safe in their surroundings. Above that, you have your belongingness and your love needs, the need to have these relationships with others, the need to feel that you belong to a group or a family or an organization, that you have friends, those psychological belongingness, those social types of needs. Above that, you then have esteem needs. Esteem needs are the need to feel that you're held in high prestige, that you are held in high esteem and high respect by those around you. Those are your esteem needs. And then at the top of the hierarchy of needs, you have this need called self-actualization. Self-actualization is essentially becoming all that you can be, as the US Army used to tell us. So be all that you can be. Achieving one's full potential is self-actualization. Now, the idea with this hierarchy of needs is that some of the needs are deficiency-based needs, some of the needs are growth-based needs. So needs such as physiological needs and safety needs, belongingness needs, and to a little lesser extent, esteem needs, those are considered to be deficiency-based needs, in that people are motivated by deficiencies in those needs. So if you don't have enough food, you don't have enough water, you don't have enough rest, you are going to be motivated to try and fill those deficiencies. So the deficiency needs, people are motivated to rectify a deficiency in those needs. At the apex of this pyramid of the hierarchy of needs is self-actualization. The self-actualization is why he refers to as a growth motivator. That people are motivated continuously to continue to grow, to achieve their full potential. So whereas with the deficiency needs, they stop serving as motivators for behavior once they are met, for the growth need, like self-actualization, that never ceases. People are constantly motivated by their desire to grow, to self-actualize, to become all that they can be. Well, we always like in this class to ask the question of so what? Well, so what? What does that mean for our understanding of organizations? What it means is we have to know our individual employees because every employee may have a different ordering of these needs. And so for some employees, safety needs will be the most important as opposed to physiological needs. For others, belongingness needs will be more important than the other deficiency needs. So we need to understand the needs of our individual employees and to recognize that individual employees are different from each other. And so we have to understand who those employees are. We have to understand where they are at in terms of their own unique hierarchy of needs. But here we're trying to fill these needs on the part of our employees and then hopefully help our employees, once they get those deficiency needs filled, to work their way up the hierarchy up to self-actualization. And then it's incumbent upon the organization to provide the opportunities for employees to self-actualize, to be able to develop the resources and develop the skills and abilities that will help them achieve their full potential. So this growth motivator of self-actualization never gets satisfied. It never goes away. It's something that will always motivate our employees. And this idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is obviously something we're going to return to a little bit later on tonight when we talk about what we call some of our content-based motivational theorists. And Maslow is one of those content-based motivational theorists, explaining how to motivate our employees to achieve a higher level and consistently higher level of performance and productivity. Someone who is a big believer in Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs is Douglas McGregor. Douglas McGregor focused most of his work on management, and he really is someone who looked a lot at managing of organizations, and so not just public organizations, but he really is very much a management-based type of theorist. And McGregor believed in this hierarchy of needs, but he felt that there were two main types of employees. There are some employees he called the Theory X employees versus other employees that he referred to as Theory Y employees. So our Theory X employees are those employees who are not very motivated. They're, for lack of a better term, lazy. They don't put forth a lot of effort. They're not terribly intelligent. They're not terribly creative. They're not good with critical thinking. These are the people who need to be directed, told what to do, and to then be managed very, very closely. Those are the Theory X employees. He says the second category of employees are what he calls the Theory Y employees. And Theory Y is just diametrically opposed to Theory X. So whereas Theory X employees are lazy, not terribly motivated, not terribly intelligent or creative, Theory Y employees are motivated. They are very much willing to work. They are creative. They are innovative. They will put forth effort without being forced to put forth that effort. They can do good work without being micromanaged and being supervised every single minute of the day. This is obviously a much more positive view of human nature in terms of his Theory Y. The problem that McGregor says is that the vast majority of our organizations are Theory X organizations, but the majority of our employees are Theory Y employees. So essentially what we are doing is we are taking these Theory Y employees and we are shoehorning them into classical Theory X types of organizations. That obviously is problematic, because these Theory Y employees are going to be motivated by the opportunity for growth, the opportunity to develop themselves as human resources. Classical Theory X organizations oftentimes do not provide those types of opportunities to those Theory Y employees. Now, McGregor is a realist, and he says not all of our employees are Theory Y. The majority are Theory Y, but we still have, for lack of a better term, a few clunkers there who are still kind of your Theory X. But the vast majority of our employees are Theory Y, yet the vast majority of our organizations are Theory X classical organizations. So what McGregor says our challenge is in organization theory is you take these Theory X organizations and transform them into Theory Y organizations. And one of the most effective ways of transforming a Theory X organization into a Theory Y organization is through strategies such as what he referred to as job enrichment. So in job enrichment, what you will do is you will allow the employee to participate in the development or the redevelopment of their jobs. So when it comes time to look at their positions and rewrite their position descriptions, we will involve the employees in the rewriting of those position descriptions. We will ask our employees, where do you see yourself in 5 years or in 10 years? Do you aspire to a leadership position? What types of skills would you like to learn as part of your job? And then offer those professional development opportunities to those individuals. So you're taking the job and you're not just enlarging it. You're just not adding on duties and adding on responsibilities, but you're adding on the responsibilities that people want to have, that will give people and afford them the opportunity to develop the skills they need to in order to self-actualize and achieve their full potential. So it's incumbent upon us to take our Theory X organizations and try and transform them into Theory Y organizations that will better match up with the wants and needs of our Theory Y types of employees. So you can see here, this is the departure from the human relations school, in that here it's not just about how to make the organization more effective. Now it's about how to help individuals self-actualize and become more effective themselves, even if the skills that we are helping them learn are skills that they take with them when they leave the organization. Developing an employee as a human resource is an important end in and of itself. It's not all just based upon what the employee is then able to give back to the organization. Then a student of Douglas McGregor was this person named Chris Argyris. You can see a picture, smiling picture of Chris Argyris on the screen there. Chris Argyris believed that there is a dynamic nature to individual employees, that they're not only are they more Theory Y than they are Theory X, but he believed they became more Theory Y as they went through their personal growth, their maturation process. So Argyris believed that as people go through this maturation process, they go through this personal growth, and this personal growth trajectory, if you will help them to develop more emotional intelligence. And as they go through this personal growth process, they tend to exhibit things such as increasing levels of activism. They become more active in their own self-determination and their own self-governance. They start serving on committees. They start serving in leadership positions. They start voting more. They start participating more in community service and community relations. They become much more active as citizens, not just citizens of the organizations, but citizens of their community as well. And we do see in the political science literature, we see a very strong relationship between the variables of age and likelihood to vote. That as people grow older, they become more and more likely to vote until they reach a high age level, until they get above 65 years old, if you consider that a high age level. But once they get beyond 65 years old, then literature shows us that there's a little tailing off of their likelihood to vote. And a lot of that's due to immobility and the difficulty they have in getting to a voting booth, and some of the physical and mental issues they may run into. But up until 65 years old, there is a very, very strong positive correlation between age and voting. And it's just an example of this increasing activism. Also, as people go through this maturation process, through this personal growth journey, they also exhibit increasing independence. They become much more independent. They're much more independent workers. They don't require the same supervision or guidance that they may have required earlier on in this personal growth journey. They also start to exhibit the ability to behave in a multiplicity of ways. They're able to behave in a lot of different ways as compared to the way in which they behaved when they were younger. They develop deepening interests. So their interests become much deeper. They're not nearly as superficial as perhaps they were 30 or 40 years ago. Their interests become much more deep in terms of it's not just about things like salary. It's not just about things like moving up the organizational ladder. It becomes more about what you're giving back to community. What are the consequences of your actions for people outside of the organization? They start to take on a much longer time perspective. So they're not as concerned about tomorrow or the next day or the next day. They're more concerned 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years down the road. As part of this personal growth journey, they also tend to aspire to superordinate positions. They aspire to leadership and supervisory positions. So obviously, it's incumbent on the organization to make those opportunities apparent to them so they may aspire to those superordinate positions. They develop a lot more self-awareness, and this is kind of that emotional intelligence that people tend to develop with the more experience that they have. They develop much more self-awareness. They become much more emotionally intelligent. And this is this personal growth process that people naturally go through, according to Chris Ardress, kind of this process of moving more and more toward a theory-wide type of orientation. But again, as Ardress tells us, classic organizations and classic organization theory inhibits this personal growth process. So it is incumbent upon the organization to help people work their way through this personal growth process. And again, you help people work their way through this personal growth process by providing with professional development opportunities that they want, helping them devise their jobs so that you can engage in this thing called job enrichment, just kind of removing the obstacles for them to go through this personal growth type of journey. So the Human Resource Management School really does place a much higher burden on organizations than what we saw with the Human Relations School. So for people like McGregor and people like Chris Ardress and the other human resource management thinkers, the way in which they define organizational effectiveness really does highlight three of our four models. So there's very much of a human relations model of organizational effectiveness within human resource management theory. You're definitely dealing with individual people within the organization. You're trying to help build cohesion and morale and help people to develop themselves as human resources. There's also clearly an internal process type of orientation as well, in that in order to know where people are in terms of this maturation process, in terms of their personal growth journey, you need to communicate with those employees. So it really places the emphasis on communication within the organization. And then obviously rational goal is another model that is highlighted. It's just here, the goal is just not the goal of the organization, but the goal is also to help develop people as human resources. Methods of coordination and control, it's very clearly mutual adjustment. So here you are working with employees, um, you're working with them to develop their supervisory abilities, to allow them to acquire more responsibility, more accountability, to help them develop as human resources. It's a lot about that give and take, that participation, kind of participative management, as opposed to direct supervision or any type of standardization like we used to see back with the classical organization school. In terms of our motivational strategies, the primary one is job identification. By allowing people to participate in the construction of their positions, you are allowing them then to identify more closely with their jobs. So whenever you're doing job enrichment, you're allowing people to identify with the work that they're doing on a daily basis. So with human resource management theory, we're really focusing a lot more on those intrinsic elements of the position and of the organization itself, as opposed to just focusing on extrinsic incentives like pay and bonuses and benefits. Now we're really focusing on the actual nature of the job itself and how that can be a motivator to help motivate people to develop as human resources. So through this development of organization theory literature, we kind of see how far we have come from the classical school. And so now we are really moving more toward not just what the individual can do for the organization, but what the organization can also give back and do for the individual employee. So based upon human resource management theory, we saw the development of another school of thought that is an outgrowth directly of human resource management theory, and that is the school of motivational theories. So the school of motivational theory builds upon a lot of these precepts that we've talked about already in human resource management, but talks about how focusing on these intrinsic motivators can help people become more productive and to what we consider to be exert effort on a much more consistent and ongoing basis. We should probably not be surprised that the human resource management literature kind of morphed into a focus on motivation, because motivation really is very much a fundamental topic in all the social sciences. Obviously, we spend a lot of time talking about it in public organization theory and in public administration, but motivation is something that's focused on in disciplines such as criminal justice. If you're in criminal justice and you're looking at how to reduce crime rates, obviously you're going to have that behavioral focus in terms of what motivates people to engage in these types of crimes. And so motivation is important in that field. Motivation is important in psychology. Whenever we're trying to understand just general behaviors, why are people motivated to think and act in a certain type of manner? Motivation, again, runs through all of our different social science disciplines, so we shouldn't be surprised that's an important part of our study of public organizations as well. Throughout the motivation literature, one thing that we have learned is that there really isn't what you would consider to be a science of motivation. As opposed to motivation being a science, it's really much more of a craft that leaders, in order to motivate employees, will draw on a variety of different techniques and ideas and insights, much more in a craft type of orientation than any type of hard and fast science. Which means that if it's not a scientifically based study, then we're probably not going to be looking for that one size fits all approach. We're not looking for that one theory that can apply across every single organization in the public sector. But we have also recognized in the development of the motivation theory literature that the constraining character of government itself and the political environment will present a lot of challenges for us in motivating our employees in public organizations. We have a lot of limitations in our ability as public managers and public leaders to motivate our employees. We don't have the same types of extrinsic motivators like money and bonus pay, merit pay, all those perks of the position. We don't have access to those types of things. So we're going to be much more limited in what we focus on. In the public sector, we tend to focus a lot more on intrinsic motivation as opposed to extrinsic motivation. So before we start getting into our motivational theories, let's again talk a little bit more about the unique nature of motivating people in public organizations. We know that our public organizations not only have these limitations on incentives, as we've already mentioned, but we also know our public organizations tend to be very complex types of structures. There's a lot of complexity in organizations in the public sector. There's a lot of fragmentation of authority and power in public sector organizations as well. The more complexity you have, the more fragmentation you have, the less likely it is that you can settle on one motivational theory to use in every single possible situation. We also know in the public sector, we deal with a lot more ambiguity. The goals in the public sector tend to be much more vague and ambiguous than goals in the private sector. In order to get legislation passed through Congress or through a state legislature, that legislation by definition must be left relatively vague and ambiguous, or else if you have too many specifics, you're not going to be possible to get a majority of legislators to agree to that piece of legislation. So the goals that come out of that legislation tend to be very ambiguous and very vague as well. When you have vague and ambiguous goals, it leads to a lot of ambiguous expectations for the performance of employees in trying to achieve those goals. Vague goals lead to vague performance expectations. When you have vague performance expectations, it's hard to motivate employees because they don't know what level of performance they're expected to be working toward. And because of all this fragmentation, you also have a lack of cohesion inside your public organizations. That lack of cohesion can also have a detrimental impact upon employee motivation. Then we have those environmental influences that are unique in the public sector as well. One that Charles Goodsell talked about a lot back in his famous study, The Case for the Bureaucracy, all the way back in 1970, is this negative view of the bureaucracy. We've talked about this before. And if you took the PPA 500 class, we spent a lot of time talking about this negative view of the term bureaucracy. The public tends to have a very negative view of bureaucracies and bureaucratic organizations. Oftentimes, that negative view of the bureaucracy comes from a negative experience. So you may have someone who's had 100 experiences with a public organization. 99 of those experiences were satisfactory, but they had one really bad, distasteful experience with one organization. That one bad experience will then color their entire perception of public organizations and the bureaucracy kind of writ large. So it's very easy for people to have a negative view of government, a negative view of public bureaucratic organizations. When we look at public opinion polls, we see that the bureaucracy usually ranks right about at the bottom in terms of public support. It's down there with the mass media and down there with rankings for Congress. And pretty soon, I think the Supreme Court is starting to drop down to that level as well. But what Goodsell argues for us is that it's difficult for us to motivate employees when they're always told that bureaucracies, their organizations, and them as bureaucrats, that they are inefficient, that they are ineffective, that they are impersonal. When you hear this over and over again, it becomes very hard to motivate public bureaucrats. So I think we do have a unique setting here in public administration that will make it a little bit more challenging for us to motivate employees in our public organizations as compared to private organizations. But before, again, we get into a discussion of motivational theories from the literature, it's important that we have a kind of common understanding of what we mean by the term motivation. I think we all kind of understand what motivation is, but just to create this common baseline for everyone, motivation in general refers to a person's desire to work hard and work well and exert that effort on a consistent basis. So work motivation is a person's desire to work hard and to work well, and not just sporadically, but to do that, exert that type of effort on a consistent basis. So we're saying we're motivating employees, that's what we're trying to get employees to do, to work hard and work well, and to do that on a very consistent basis. But before you can develop theories to understand how to better motivate employees, you must first know how motivated those employees are. So you need to be able to measure employee motivational levels. When you're measuring motivation in a public organization, you are measuring someone's perceptions and opinions. And you know from the research methods courses that you have taken in the past, when you are measuring someone's perceptions or opinions, you're probably going to be extracting that information directly from the individual. So you're probably going to be using a survey, a questionnaire, maybe interviews or focus groups, getting the information directly from that individual employee. So what the literature has given to us is it's given to us some survey questions that can be used in order to measure employee motivation. So some of those surveys that come to us from the literature are things such as the job motivation scale. The job motivation scale is a questionnaire that really measures those direct measures of job motivation through questions such as, and a lot of these are not just questions, some of them are going to be statements, but on most days on your job, how often does time seem to drag for you? Obviously, if time drags for you, you're probably not very happy in your job. You're probably not terribly motivated. Some people are completely involved in their job. They're involved in it absorbed in it day and night. For other people, their job is simply one of several interests. How involved do you feel in your job? How often do you do some extra work for your job that isn't really required of you? Would you say that you work harder, less hard, or about the same as other people doing your type of work in your organization. So this one kind of really gets at the equity issue. And we'll see a little bit later on as we go through the motivation literature. Equity is a very important part of motivation literature, that if you do not have people feel that they're being treated in a fair and equitable manner, then you're going to have a lot of difficulty in motivating those employees. So that's what's referred to as the job motivation scale. Another survey that's used is what's called the work motivation scale. And so some of the statements on the work motivation scale, I put forth my best effort to get the job done regardless of the difficulties. And again, with these types of statements, as you know, in surveys, we usually link those with our like or ordinal response categories. So strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, disagree, and strongly disagree. So I put forth my best effort to get the job done regardless of difficulties. I am willing to start work early or stay late to finish a job. The next one is the reversed one. So we're looking kind of at a negative correlation here. It has been hard for me to get very involved in my current job. So the more someone strongly agrees with that, the more that's an indicator of low levels of job motivation. I do extra work for my job that isn't really expected of me. And then the final one there is another reverse. Time seems to drag while I am on the job, very similar to what we saw with the job motivation scale. Again, that's a reversed one using that like or ordinal response scale. Third one that's sometimes used, some Lawler and Hall, is intrinsic motivation scales. The intrinsic motivation scale refers to the motivating effects of the work itself. So how motivated are you by the work you are doing on a daily basis? So when I do my work well, it gives me a feeling of accomplishment. When I perform my job well, it contributes to my personal growth and development. I feel a great sense of personal satisfaction when I do my job well, and doing my job well increases my self-esteem. So how much motivation is intrinsic within the work that people are doing? Then another one's reward expectancies from Hal Rainey. Reward expectancies look at if people are getting the rewards and getting the incentives that they expect to get. This is a focus of one of the largest annual measurements of employee motivation and engagement that we have done at the federal level, and it's the Federal Employee Attitude Survey. And I have linked the 2023 Federal Employee Attitude Survey to our Canvas site. So if you want to, you can go and you can take a look at it. It's a long document. I think it's probably 200 or 300 pages, but it shows you a lot of the questions that we ask in order to see how engaged and how motivated federal employees are. And one of the main areas of focus is to see how satisfied people are with the rewards that they are receiving for their work. So producing a high quality of work increases my chances for higher pay. Producing a high quality of work increases my chances for a promotion. So do they believe that their work is actually paying off and that they're getting the rewards and the incentives that they expect to get? Then the fifth one there, peer evaluations, will have people evaluate the motivation of their peers. So you'll evaluate your peers' motivation in terms of things such as team attitude. Are they a team player? Do they support working in groups? Task concentration. How good are they at staying on task and getting a job done? Are they an independent self-starter, or do they need to have a lot of direct supervision in order to get them started with a task? Organizational identification, how closely or how well do they identify with their organization? Job curiosity, how curious they are about the work that goes on within the organization and what different people are doing, and how all those different jobs then work together and combine together to achieve organizational goals. Persistence, how likely they are to stick with even difficult tasks until you can get those difficult tasks done. And professional identification, how closely do I identify with their professions? And so if they're a professional engineer, how closely do I identify with the standards and norms and expectations of the engineering society, or if they're a public administrator, how closely do they identify with the principles of, say, for instance, the American Society for Public Administration. So that's not a universal list. That is just kind of a cursory look at some of the ways in which we can measure motivation on the part of our employees. Because again, before we can determine if we need to apply theories and concepts to try and enhance employee motivation, we actually need to know what those employees' motivational levels look like. So that annual study that I talked about, that I linked up to our Canvas site, it's a really interesting read. And if you do have time to take a look at it, I would certainly recommend it. But we have a little bit of time here. So let me stop this share. And let me, if I can find it, share out the actual document itself so you can see what it looks like. Let me scroll down here and I will find it. Give me 1 second. Hopefully I'll find it. Hasn't disappeared. Okay. Let me share this out. And this is the actual annual study that's done at the federal level across all federal organizations, federal agencies, federal departments, federal commissions, that looks at the amount of motivation and the engagement level of federal employees. And so I'm just going to show you a couple things, and then you can go and take a look at it at your leisure. But here are some of the questions or statements that got the highest responses from federal employees versus those that got the lowest responses. So on the left side with the highest responses, it is important to me that my work contribute to the common good. Question 90 on the survey, 92% of employees agreed or strongly agreed with that. I think that's a really good reflection of the fact that people work in the public sector for public interest. They are there to help contribute to public interest, to contribute to the public good, to the common good. That's very much an intrinsic type of motivator that people, they really do derive some satisfaction from contributing to the public good. So I think that's a very good, very positive type of result. Employees in my work unit meet the needs of our customers. 87% agree with that. That's important as well because it shows that it's not just about necessarily what's going on within the organization, but it's also about recognizing the impact that the work being done in this public organization, what impact that then has on the lives of citizens and however you want to term them, citizens, consumers, or members of the public. 87%, my supervisor holds me accountable for achieving results. 86%, I'm held accountable for the quality of work that I produce. 86%, my supervisor treats me with respect. 85%, I know how my work relates to the agency's goals. This is important, obviously, for goal congruence, and we'll talk more about goal congruence in a couple of minutes. 85% employees in my work unit contribute positively to my agency's performance. 84%, I know what my work unit's goals are. Again, it's important to know what the goals are before you can expect people to be motivated to work toward the achievement of those goals. My supervisor supports my need to balance work and other life issues. Employees in my work unit produce high quality work. My organization's prepared me for potential cybersecurity threats. That's obviously a new one that was added in the past few years. So it doesn't really fit a lot of the other ones, but I think it's still an important question that gets asked. The problematic areas, though, are on the right side of the screen. And these are the lowest percentages of positive responses. The lowest response was, in my work unit, differences in performance are recognized in a meaningful way. That's a red flag for public organizations, at least here at the federal level, in terms of this issue of equity. Management involves employees in decisions that affect their work, 46%. This is directly relevant to our human resource management theorists and the idea of job identification and job enrichment. I believe the results of this study, well, we don't have to worry about that one. In my organization, senior leaders generate high levels of motivation and commitment to the workforce, 50-50. So you would like that to be a lot higher. How satisfied are you with your involvement in decisions that affect your work? Again, relates directly back to job enrichment. And not a very high score there. You'd like that to be a lot higher, and so on and so on. We won't go through them all, but you can kind of see some of the most positive responses versus some of the most negative responses. But just kind of to cut to the chase in this study, it's also interesting to say to kind of take a look at um, who works in public organizations at the federal level. The generational overview. This survey is done every single year. It has been done every single year for a number of years, and this is something that really changes a lot from year to year. You'll see in terms of the total workforce, traditionalists, those employees born before 1945, are now less than 1% of the workforce, which is not surprising. Baby boomers born between 46 and 64 are about 20% of the workforce now. Again, that number keeps going down with each ensuing year. The plurality of employees are Gen Xers born between 65 and 1980. An ever increasing percentage of Gen Yers, 1981 to 1996. About a third of the federal workforce are now Generation Y. And then now we've seen Generation Z, born 1997 and later. We've seen people starting to enter the public workforce. It's up to 4% now in 2023 for public employees at the federal level. This is kind of interesting to keep an eye on how you have these changes in generations, because there's a whole body of literature that we're not going to get into in this class, but a whole body of literature that looks at managing different generations and different strategies that can be used for managing employees from different generations. We won't worry about response rates, but one thing I do want to show you is what they have done in the study is they have divided up our organizations at the federal level between based on size. So from very small organizations, less than 100 employees, small organizations, 100 to about 1,000, medium are 1,000 to 10,000, large over 10,000 to almost 75,000, and then very large organizations over 75,000. The moral of the story is that motivational levels and engagement levels tend to be directly related to the size of the organization. You can see here this employee engagement index, which basically measures how engaged and motivated employees are. You can see that across our different size organizations, there tends to be a pretty strong relationship between size and employee engagement. Very small organizations with less than 100 employees, they tend to have the highest rates of employee engagement and motivation. Very large organizations tend to have the lowest. The difference is 77% down to 71%. And with a little change there between small and medium, for the most part, it is a strong negative correlation between organization size and the engagement and motivation of employees. Then they pull out for special recognition some of the highest scoring agencies in terms of engagement and motivation. You'll see for a very small organization, the Marine Mammal Commission comes in at 98% of employees report that they are engaged and motivated in their work. Now, that Marine Mammal Commission is a commission made up of, I believe, 12 marine biologists, people with their PhDs in marine biology. And so they work very closely together. They tend to have a very high engagement motivation level. For small organizations, it's the National Indian Gaming Commission at 89%, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission at 83% for a medium-sized organization. For a large organization, the General Services Administration, if you're not familiar with the GSA, the primary job of the GSA is to handle a lot of those administrative overhead functions for all the other agencies and departments across the federal government. So when a federal agency leases office space in a private office building, those leases are managed by the General Services Administration. A lot of the management of buying supplies in bulk and things like that also flow through general services. So the GSA is an organization that serves other federal organizations. And then for very large organizations, the top scoring organization is the Department of Health and Human Services, coming in at 78%. But you can see the differences in overall percentages between your top scoring very small versus your top scoring very large organization. The nice thing, though, is among most of the organizations, we have seen an uptick between 2022 and 2023 in reported engagement and motivation levels. And so we're moving up, and the trajectory is certainly in a positive direction. I don't want to belabor this too much, but I do want to show you that there has been a lot of thought given to this idea of measuring the motivation levels and engagement levels of public employees, especially at the federal level. So much so that we put a lot of effort and a lot of resources into producing this study on an annual basis. And if you want, you can go and look at all of the different studies over all the different years, and you can kind of track these changes at least over the past 15 or so years. So I think we've established at this point that motivation is important in public organizations. You know, if we want to find out how to have higher performance levels, we want to have higher organizational effectiveness levels, we're going to have a well-engaged and well-motivated workforce. But we also have to recognize that motivation is not the singular determinant for performance. That performance is really based upon a multitude of factors in addition to motivation. Ability levels, training levels, preparation level of employees, employees' perceptions about their ability to perform their jobs successfully. Those are all rival influences on performance in addition to motivation. So I don't want you to walk away from this discussion tonight thinking motivation is the only way to enhance performance. It is one of several different reasons why performance levels can be increased. But our purpose tonight, though, is to look at motivation and the impact of these motivational theories on public organizations, because again, they grow directly out of the human resource management school. So I think probably the best way to look at each one of these theories of work motivation is to categorize them into two separate categories: content-based theories versus process-based theories. So content-based theories of motivation are theories of motivation that look at the particular needs, motives, and rewards that affect an employee's motivational level. So we're actually looking at the content of what motivates an employee. So, pay versus recognition as employee of the week. Those are the types of things we're looking at with content-based theories. So actually what motivates employees. Then the second category of theories are process-oriented theories. Process-oriented theories will concentrate on the psychological and the behavioral processes that underpin motivation. So the process by which we motivate. So content of what motivates people versus the processes we use to motivate employees. So for the content-based theories, we're going to look at 4 theorists. For the process-based theories, we're then going to look at an additional 4 theorists. So overall, a total of 8 theorists between content and process-based. So in terms of our content-based motivational theories for public organizations, we have 2 very familiar names there: Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, and Douglas McGregor with his theory X and his theory Y, which we just talked about a couple of minutes ago. Then we have Frederick Herzberg with his 2-factor theory, and then McClellan with what he calls his needs-based model. So very quickly, Maslow and McGregor, we've been there and done that. So, Maslow is based upon this hierarchy of needs. And again, people are motivated in the deficiency needs by filling a deficiency. In the growth need of self-actualization, they are motivated by the desire to grow and to be all that they can be and to achieve their full and utmost potential. So this kind of gives us an idea of what motivates individuals. Again, the importance here with Maslow is that everyone may have a different hierarchy of needs. So you kind of need to know where an employee is on their hierarchy of needs to understand how best to motivate that employee. So we talked about with McGregor a couple minutes ago, his theory X and theory Y. Theory X is this traditional theory that assumes that workers lack the capacity for self-motivation. Therefore, they must be strictly controlled and directed by the organization. Theory Y is based on Maslowian higher order needs. It emphasizes considering those needs when designing organizations to make your jobs more interesting and more responsible. So again, this is your job enrichment so that people can better identify with their positions. So you need to know the type of employee you are dealing with. Is it more of a theory X employee? Is it more of a theory Y employee? As Chris Ardress would tell us, where is that employee on their personal growth journey? Have they moved more from the theory X to the theory Y? And if so, they are motivated then accordingly. So a theory Y employee is motivated more by focusing on those higher order needs like self-actualization. A theory X employee is motivated more by filling the deficiencies that they currently have in their deficiency needs. Then Frederick Herzberg, who, if you are in the MPA program, you may have run into Frederick Herzberg before in his two-factor theory. Herzberg argues that there are two types of factors that may have an influence upon worker motivation. The first factor is what's referred to as motivators. The second factor is referred to as hygiene factors. So with motivator factors, we're looking at those intrinsic incentives, things such as someone's interest in their work, like what Ardress and McGregor told us, their desire for achievement in their higher order needs, like what Abraham Maslow told us. Those are considered to be motivators. Those are things that will motivate people to work harder and exert effort on a consistent basis. Contrast that to what he calls the hygiene factors. Hygiene factors are your more extrinsic incentives. So things such as organizational conditions and rewards. So additional pay, additional benefits and perks of the job. Those are considered to be hygiene types of factors. They are extrinsic as opposed to intrinsic. The importance here is that hygiene factors, those extrinsic incentives, can only prevent job dissatisfaction. So they can keep people from being dissatisfied in their jobs, but they are not able to motivate employees. They only keep people from being dissatisfied. It's the intrinsic incentives, those motivators, that are the ones that are essential to increasing worker motivation. So Herzberg tells us when we want to motivate public employees, we need to focus on those intrinsic incentives as opposed to extrinsic incentives. Then your fourth content-based author is McClellan. And McClellan presents us with what he refers to as his needs-based model. According to McClellan, there are three different types of motivational needs. There's achievement motivation, authority power motivation, and affiliation motivation. These different motivators, these different motivational needs will motivate different types of employees. He essentially says that where someone is in their personal growth journey, as Ardress tells us, will dictate which type of motivator will work for them. For the majority of our Theory Y employees, achievement motivation is how we motivate those employees. And he defines achievement motivation as a dynamic restlessness to achieve mastery over one's environment through success at achieving goals by using one's own cunning, ability, and effort. So it's this desire to achieve mastery over your environment. That's what he considers to be the achievement motivation. So for your Theory Y employees, they're going to be mostly motivated by achievement. For your employees who are not quite to that place there on their personal growth journey, an affiliation motivation may work better for those employees. They are motivated by the need to feel they're part of something, the need to feel that they're part of a group, that they really do belong in this organization. And that type of affiliation motivation is what will motivate those employees. For leaders and managers, according to McClellan, leaders and managers tend to be motivated primarily by the authority power motivation. They are motivated by the desire to build their power base so that they have more power that they can exercise over other people in the organization. And basically, when we're talking about power, we are again talking about the ability to utilize resources to influence people to do something they otherwise would not do. And so it's really the authority power motivation that appeals primarily to those leaders and those managers. So people in those upper level supervisory positions in the organization. So let's compare these four different content-based theories to each other and kind of see how they relate to each other. So in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when you're looking at the bottom of that hierarchy of needs, you're looking, it should be physiological, but you're looking at those physiological needs, those needs for safety, those needs for belongingness, and to a little bit lesser extent, the need for self-esteem. When you're looking at those deficiency needs tend to correlate well with a theory X type of an employee. Correlates well with the hygiene factors that Herzberg told us about in his two-factor theory, and correlates well with the desire for power and affiliation, those types of motivators. For Maslow's growth needs, his self-actualization, the higher order needs, those are the ones that relate to theory Y of McGregor. Those are the motivators that we are looking at with Frederick Herzberg. And that's the achievement motivation that McClellan says that these theory Y employees crave. So you can kind of see this comparison between the different content-based theories of motivation in terms of what actually motivates individual employees. But since different employees are motivated by different motivators, we need to understand those employees, where they are on their personal growth journey, their wants and their needs, before we can properly motivate those employees. So it really does feed into this whole idea that is an undercurrent that runs through the entire evolution of organization theory, which is the movement away from a one-size-fits-all approach like with the classical theorists, and a movement more toward a contextual contingency-based approach, where we have to look at the individual employee and manage people differently depending upon their wants and their needs. But regardless of which of the content-based theories you're applying at a given point in time in an organization, as we had mentioned before, equity is still a very important issue. If people do not feel that they're being treated in a fair and an equitable manner, you're going to fail to motivate those employees, irrespective of which of those content-based theories you are using. So in terms of this idea of fairness and equity, employees look at it as an equation, in that there are certain things that they're bringing to the organization. There are certain job inputs that they are contributing to the organization. The job they're doing, the time, their effort, their abilities, their flexibility, their commitment, their honesty, their collegiality, their heart, their integrity, the respect. Those are all inputs that they are bringing to the organization. Those are the contributions they're providing. In exchange for those contributions, they then anticipate to get a fair distribution of job outputs. Paycheck, benefits, vacation time, security, recognition, responsibility, respect, sense of purpose, sense of achievement. Those are all the outputs that they're getting from the organization. So there is this need for a perceived balance between job inputs, the contributions, and the job outputs, the incentives that they are receiving. If there is an imbalance between the job inputs and the job outputs, then there's going to be a feeling that they are not being treated fairly, they're not being treated equitably, and this is where it becomes very difficult for us to motivate our employees. Closely related to this idea of fairness and equity is the notion of organizational justice. People need to feel that they are working in just organizations, organizations that will exhibit this fairness and equity in both the distribution of rewards and resources, as well as the processes that are used in deciding how those resources and rewards are being distributed. So there are two types of organizational justice. There's distributive justice and procedural justice. Distributive justice, again, is the fairness and equity in the actual distribution of rewards and resources. So you think back to that question on the annual survey of federal employees that asked employees how fair they thought the distribution of resources was between different employees in the organization. That's a distributive justice type of notion. So are these rewards being fairly distributed based upon performance across the organization? Procedural justice looks at the processes by which these rewards are being distributed. So distributive justice is, who has gotten what. Procedural justice is how have they gotten it? What has been the process by which those rewards have been handed out to employees? Clearly and commonsensically, the literature shows us that perceptions of higher levels of justice in organizations are strongly correlated with positive work-related attitudes, which are strongly correlated with higher levels of motivation. And those higher levels of motivation are then strongly correlated with higher levels of performance. And research is something we would refer to as an approach known as a path analysis, that this leads to this, which leads to this, which then leads to this. So people need to feel that they're being treated fairly and equitably, and that there is justice, not only in who got what, but the process used to determine who gets which rewards, who gets which incentives. So then our second category of motivational theories are our process-based types of theories. And again, here we're going to look at 4 different theorists that fall into the process-based category. Vroom in his expectancy theory, B.F. Skinner in his operant conditioning and reinforcement, Bandura in his social learning cognitive theory, and then Edwin Locke in his goal-setting theory. So these are 4 process-oriented theories that look at the processes that are used to motivate employees. So this first one from Paul Vroom, expectancy theory, is one of my favorite theories because I think it does explain some of the thought process that employees tend to go through in our public organizations in deciding how much effort they should exert at a certain period of time for a certain type of task or duty. The primary claim behind Paul Vroom's expectancy theory is that an individual employee considering an outcome will sum up the values of all the potential outcomes that will result from a certain course of action, and then will weigh each one of those outcomes by the probability of that outcome occurring. So it kind of gets back to that Chester Barnard incentives and contributions. This theory of expectancy theory is really based upon the classic utilitarian idea of rational self-interest. So we are making an assumption here that employees are rational self-interested actors. A rational self-interested actor is going to look at the benefits of a course of action and compare those benefits to the costs of a certain type of action. A rational self-interested actor will attempt to try and maximize their pleasure, maximize their benefits, while minimizing their pain, minimizing their costs. So if they can maximize their benefits while minimizing their costs, that's the type of action that they will then end up pursuing. So this idea of expectancy theory is based upon 3 main concepts: valence, expectancies, and instrumentality. This first concept of valence. Valence refers to the emotional orientation that someone holds with respect to outcomes or rewards. So in other words, how important is this outcome or this reward to this individual? How important is this to them that they would receive some type of bonus pay, or that they would receive some additional flexibility in how they're doing their job, or that they would be able to try a new challenge or try something new? So how much value do they place on those potential rewards, those potential outcomes? People will have different valence levels for different types of potential outcomes. For some people, recognition is a very important outcome. So if they can be recognized as Employee of the Week, that means a lot to them. And so they'll place a high valence level on being Employee of the Week. For other people, they don't care a bit about being Employee of the Week, and so that has a very low valence level for those individuals. So valence level is basically how much they care about these rewards. Then there's expectancy. Expectancy as a concept refers to the confidence of an employee that if they put forth a certain amount of effort, that effort will then lead to a certain level of performance. So how confident are they in their capabilities? And then instrumentality refers to the perception of the employee that if they achieve this performance level, then these outcomes, these rewards will actually result. So if they are promised that if they get this report done by Monday, they will then be rewarded and recognized as being employee of the week. Well, do they believe that? How confident are they that they actually will be recognized as employee of the week if they get this report done by Monday? So the basic Vroom formula, and again, I don't think that employees sit down with a calculator or a pad and paper and calculate all this out. They don't do that, but just more of on a subjective type of basis, they're going to go through this thought process that's kind of reflected in this formula. In the formula, the left side is F. F stands for function, which means that their effort is a function of the following things. The E to P term on the left side stands for the probability that a certain level of effort will lead to a certain performance level. So if I'm supposed to get this report done. And so if I put forth the effort of coming in and working on a Saturday, that's the level of effort. How confident am I that if I come in and work on Saturday, it will result in me getting the report done by Monday? Am I 100% confident, 70% confident, 50% confident? How confident am I that this level of effort will lead to this desired level of performance? Then the P to O term is how confident am I that this level of performance will lead to a desired outcome? So how confident am I that if I get this report done, that I will then be rewarded with employee of the week? 100%, 80%, 60%, how confident am I? And then the V stands for the valence level. That's the value that I place upon that outcome of being recognized as being employee of the week. So the amount of effort someone puts in will be dependent upon their expectancy. How confident are they that if I put forth this amount of effort, I'll reach this performance level? How much trust do they have in their supervisor in terms of instrumentality, that if I achieve this performance level, they'll actually give me this outcome, this reward? And then the V, the valence level, the amount of value I place upon that outcome, upon that reward. So the implication for public managers with the Vroom's expectancy theory is that managers need to understand what individual employees value. So how much value they place upon different types of intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. Managers also have to understand the confidence level of their employees in their own abilities. So it's very important to accurately assess the skills and weaknesses of employees to know how confident they are that a certain level of effort will lead to this certain level of performance. And then instrumentality, managers must come through on their promises. If these outcomes, these rewards are being promised, then they need to be delivered upon. Expectancy theory is a very big part of the motivational literature. And expectancy theory today in the motivational literature is kind of used in what you have known from your social science research classes as a regression analysis. So if you're familiar with regression analysis, you know that you have a dependent variable, and then you look at the influence of independent variables on that dependent variable. And so oftentimes the amount of effort that someone's going to put in is going to then be determined by things like the extrinsic rewards of pay, job security, promotion, intrinsic rewards such as work satisfaction. So we're going to look at the relationship between all those independent variables and the amount of effort that someone is willing to put into their jobs. I think we see expectancy theory used all over public organizations. Certainly when you have any pay for performance systems, it's a major thing that underpins all those pay for performance systems. But again, I don't think that employees sit down and really calculate these probabilities, but on a more theoretical level, I think they're very aware of all these probabilities and expectancy theory in determining how much effort I want to put forth for a certain type of task at a certain point in time. So that's a process-based theory known as expectancy theory. Then a second process-based theory comes to us from the world of psychology, and that's B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning. Operant conditioning makes the argument that animals, and then by extension people, will develop behaviors in response to external stimuli. And so people will develop and shape and modify behaviors based upon their environment and the consequences they receive for those behaviors that they are exhibiting. So people will repeat behaviors where they get a positive consequence, and they'll drop or extinguish behaviors when they get a negative consequence. So operant conditioning just basically says that we are going to use consequences in order to modify the occurrence and form of behavior on the part of our employees. So there is a relationship between behavior and the contingencies of these consequences and these reinforcements on that behavior. Now, it sounds very negative, but operant conditioning also tells us that when we are dealing with human beings, positive reinforcements are usually much more effective than negative reinforcements. Positive reinforcements provide the most efficient means of influencing employee behavior. Punishment is far less efficient and effective. The most efficient way to influence behavior is by using what's called an intermittent reinforcement schedule. In an intermittent reinforcement schedule, these reinforcements, whatever they may be, if they are like praise or if they are, anything that the employee values, those positive reinforcements are provided at highly variable intervals. The less predictable it is when these reinforcements occur, the more successful they tend to be. The more predictable the use of those reinforcements are, the less likely it is that people will associate those reinforcements with the behavior. So you have an intermittent reinforcement schedule providing reinforcements at a highly variable interval that may require more time for people to acquire the behavior, but they hold on to that behavior much longer. The extinction of the behavior is much slower than it is if you don't use an intermittent reinforcement schedule. But this whole idea of operant conditioning is that people will change and modify their behaviors based upon these reinforcements, hopefully positive reinforcements that they receive. Albert Bandura, in his social learning cognitive theory, is our third process-oriented theory that kind of draws out and kind of comes from operant conditioning. And in social learning cognitive theory, the assumption here is that people do learn from consequences, but they learn from other things beyond just consequences. That people will go through this learning process internally, and their internal cognitive process by which they acquire information and assimilate that information and analyze that information and then use that behavior to then use that information then generate their behaviors. That is an internal cognitive process that people use, and we can utilize that internal cognitive process to then shape the behavior of employees. So in social learning cognitive theory, we understand that individuals learn behaviors in ways other than just this extra reinforcement. That people learn and acquire behaviors through things such as modeling the behavior of other people. So they'll watch what other people do and they'll then model that behavior as their own. This is why we oftentimes say in public administration that public managers have very much of what we call an expository role. By an expository role, we mean that public managers role model. They present these models of behavior that people can then watch and can then learn from. People also learn through vicarious experiences. So someone doesn't have to go through a process themselves. They don't have to go through an experience themselves to learn from it. They can watch someone else go through that experience, live vicariously through that person, and that vicarious experience can help shape and mold their behavior. People also learn behaviors through mental rehearsal and imagery. And so whenever you have to give an important presentation, you're probably going to rehearse that in your mind mentally over and over again. That mental rehearsal and imagery will then help cement and solidify the behaviors that you think will be positive behaviors that will lead to a good presentation. And people also then establish behaviors through goal setting. So they will establish goals for themselves and they will engage in self-management of the achievement of those goals. So in Bandura, we're really looking at how people think and how people process information as a way in which you can mold behavior. And so if you can role model for people, you can provide experiences they can live vicariously through, you can teach them how to establish goals, then hold themselves accountable for those goals. That's all part of this thing called social learning cognitive theory, another way that you can mold the behavior of employees to then help them find ways to exert that effort on a continuous, ongoing basis. But speaking of goal setting, that leads us to our fourth process-based motivational theory, which is Edwin Locke's goal setting theory. Goal setting theory simply states that difficult goals lead to higher performance levels than easy to accomplish goals, no goals, or vague goals. So it seems kind of counterintuitive that a difficult to accomplish goal actually will motivate people more than a goal that is easy to accomplish. But the more difficult the goal, the more the achievement in accomplishing that goal. People need to be committed to those goals. And so the more difficult goals are the ones that people tend to be more committed to and will persist with for a longer period of time. Feedback is always important when you're using goals in order to motivate employees, because employees need to receive feedback on if they're falling short on a goal. Why are they falling short on the goal? And then through formative feedback, what thing can they then do to better accomplish this goal and make progress toward the goal? The more people are committed to the goal, the higher the value of the goal, the better chance they are to achieve those goals. So specifically, how do goals affect the behavior of employees? Goals may have several benefits to them. Number one, they may direct the attention to the employee. So they kind of show the employee what to focus on, what to pay attention to. They will intensify the efforts of those employees. They will intensify the persistence of those employees to continue to work toward this difficult goal. And then they'll also spark creativity and problem solving, where people will start to critically think about other avenues and other ways in which they can accomplish these goals. Again, the assignment of difficult goals enhances performance because those goals appeal to people's motivation to achieve. So it appeals to McClellan's achievement motivation. Essentially, the greater the success, the greater the satisfaction. So some recommendations for goal setting. Establishing more difficult goals that are less likely to be achieved will end up leaving people unsatisfied. That then in turn fosters their ambition and pushes them to strive further to achieve those goals. So even though there can be some frustration associated with not achieving complex goals, what it does create is the lack of achievement of that goal leaves people unsatisfied. It creates a tension on the part of these employees. The way in which these employees can then release that tension is by achieving that goal. So it makes them work harder to achieve those more difficult goals. Paula, go ahead.
Yeah, this is interesting just to make sure I understand it. So like it not achieving a goal immediately isn't necessarily a bad, like that can serve as a greater motivator. So even if you set a goal that you think like might not is questionable if an employee can achieve it, it still might be a good thing to do to kind of push them to go farther than they thought they could.
Yeah, exactly. I think if it's a difficult goal that you know it's going to be difficult for them to achieve, then it will push them to work harder and to try and achieve that goal. It's important that it's a difficult goal and not an impossible goal. And so if it's an impossible goal, obviously it's going to lead to a lot of frustration. You know they're never going to get there. They know they're never going to get there. And eventually they'll get to the point of just giving up. So it needs to be a difficult goal, but yet not an impossible goal to try and achieve. It does sound kind of paradoxical, but it does. Creates that tension, and people then release that tension by working harder to achieve that more difficult goal. So that's exactly right. Goal setting is important that you have management support, obviously, for the setting of those goals. It's also good to try and mix qualitative and quantitative goals, kind of this mixed methodology that I'm sure you talked about in your various research methods courses. Assigning responsibility for which individual is responsible for the achievement of those goals. So you have a way you can hold people accountable for the achievement of the goals. The old adage in strategic planning is if you're always planning, you're never actually doing. And so for a successful strategic plan, when you establish the goals and put together an action plan, you need to assign responsibility for who is responsible for the achievement of those goals. Involving employees is obviously important as well. And that goes all the way back to Mary Parker Follett, her idea of democratic organizations and participation. The more people can participate in the development of the strategies and tactics for achieving the goals, the more buy-in they will have in terms of achieving those goals. The more buy-in they have, the more they feel that they were part of the entire process. Goal setting requires effective leadership. Obviously, if leaders are not supportive of those goals, then you're not going to have clear and unambiguous goals. It's very important to have a feedback loop so that people understand what they can do differently in order to accomplish the goals. As we said before, people need to be committed to those goals, and you need to be very careful to be aware of goal overload. If you have a multiplicity of goals, you have too many goals, sometimes those goals will obviously come into conflict with each other. As they come into conflict with each other, then they kind of cancel each other out, and sometimes employees don't know which goal to try and achieve if you have multiple conflicting goals. But Edwin Locke basically tells us that goals are very important for us because what they can do is they can help focus employee behavior and they can serve as a motivator, especially if you have an employee who is very much motivated by achievement in order to try and achieve those more difficult goals. So it's just another approach to how you can motivate your employees, this time establishing and using goals for the purpose of employee motivation. So given those content-based theories and those process-based theories that we have talked about, where are we now in terms of motivational theory? One thing we know in motivational theory is that there is no singular theory that has provided a conclusive explanation for motivation. There is no one single magic bullet. There's no one panacea. That instead, what we are looking for is the more contextual theories that can apply in different types of settings. The search for the universal theory is fruitless. And so one of the things the literature is looking at now in motivation is creating taxonomies, creating different motivational types for different motivational settings. And so in this type of setting with this type of employee who is at this point in their personal growth journey, here's a type of strategy that tends to be more effective in this situation than it may be in another situation. So what it leads to is kind of a disjointed type of literature, but what it does is it recognizes the complexities of motivation and how you really need to take into account the specifics of the context of the situation in deciding how most effectively to motivate your employees. But when we're talking about motivations, obviously we're talking a lot about incentives as well. Because when we're providing these rewards and these outcomes, these rewards and outcomes are usually incentives. And there's always this discussion about intrinsic versus extrinsic incentives and their use in the public sector. I know we have now gone past 7:30 and we haven't done a break yet. So I do have a few more slides here, but let's go ahead and take a break because I don't want to keep going and going without a break. So let's take a break until 7:45. Come back at 7:45 and we'll talk about the role that incentives play in motivating employees. And then I'll also introduce you to a theory by Anthony Downs about the different types of employees and how we can motivate different types of employees in different types of ways with different types of motivators. So take a break till 7:45. We'll come back and then we'll focus on the role of incentives in the motivation of public employees. Okay, it's 7:45, so we are back from break. We have talked several times, kind of alluded to several times up to this point in our discussion of motivational theories about the role played by incentives. Frederick Herzberg told us about motivators versus hygiene factors. intrinsic versus extrinsic incentives, but I think we should spend a little bit of time talking about the role that incentives do play in motivation. The one thing we do know, obviously, is that we're much more limited in using extrinsic motivators such as extra pay in the public sector. And we're much more limited in the public sector because of our personnel processes, our civil service regulations, having these position classifications. If you do any work in human resource management, you know that uh, in order for an employee to get higher pay, oftentimes there has to be a reclassification study, and that reclassification study would then change their job classification in the position classification system, which would then make them eligible for a higher pay band. But in order to do that reclassification study, you have to have empirical evidence that's necessary, empirical evidence that the actual nature of the job has changed. So it's usually not as easy as just saying we're going to reward people with additional pay. Those extrinsic incentives are oftentimes not available to us in motivating employees. But we also have to recognize that not all government agencies are the same. There's some government agencies that are more unionized than other agencies. I think those agencies that have high levels of employee unionization combined with the civil service system, those are the agencies where it's much more difficult to introduce pay for performance plans. If you have an agency that does not have high levels of unionization, so you do not have the normal meet and confer process, you don't have the collective bargaining agreement, then I think it could be easier then to use pay for performance. Pay for performance at the federal level has not really met with a lot of success. We saw pay for performance used most notably in the Civil Service Reform Act back in 1978, where Congress guaranteed bonus pay to people who joined the senior executive service, this top echelon of the career civil service, what used to be General Schedule 16, 17, and 18 positions, were invited to join this new senior executive service. If you joined the senior executive service, you gave up some of your civil service protections, but you were then eligible for bonus pay based upon the performance of your organization. The problem in that instance was that those bonus pay promises were never carried through with on the part of Congress. Congress never made good on those bonus pay promises. They basically violated instrumentality, as Paul Vroom would tell us in his expectancy theory. And it's for that reason that that most notable attempt at pay for performance really did fail at the federal level. But if we are not able to use the same extrinsic incentives, the same extrinsic motivators that our counterparts are able to use in the private sector, does that lead to a situation where public sector employees are naturally less motivated than their private sector counterparts? What the research has shown us, and there's been a lot of research on this topic, is that there are, on occasion in some studies, differences in motivation levels between the sectors. And that self-reported motivation levels among private sector employees do tend to be a little bit higher than among public sector employees. However, the research has also shown us those differences in motivation levels are not usually statistically significant. And you're familiar with the concept of statistical significance. You know, statistical significance tells us if differences are large enough that we can be confident they did not happen by random chance. Usually the motivational differences between private and public employees are not large enough that we can confidently say that those differences did not happen by random chance. So despite all the constraints and all the limitations in the public sector to using incentives, for the most part, public employees tend to have relatively high levels of motivation. We can see that in the federal study every year on employee attitudes. And typically, you can go back as many years as you want, but every single year we see that employee engagement and motivation levels, at least at the federal level, tend to be relatively high. And the trend has been for those levels to continue to increase. We thought that maybe COVID would interrupt those increases, but for the most part, they really haven't. And we've seen this general progression upward in terms of employee engagement and motivation levels. So some theories on incentives that help explain employee motivation and engagement levels come from people like Chester Barnard. Now, I had warned you earlier that we talk a lot about Chester Barnard in public administration in general, and especially here in our focus on organization theory. We talked about Chester Barnard when we talked about human relations. We also mentioned Chester Barnard as we've talked about motivation as well. And we'll also talk about Chester Barnard next week when we talk about systems theory. So his writings really cover a lot of different topics in public management and administration. But the application of Chester Barnard to this discussion of the use of incentives for motivation is really where he defines for us these two categories of what he calls worker-specific incentives and non-specific incentives. Worker-specific incentives are incentives that are material, non-material, maybe work conditions, but that apply directly to specific employees. So these are incentives that are provided to certain employees, oftentimes based upon their performance levels. They can be material, like pay. They could be non-material, like recognitions. They could be work conditions, like flexibility that's afforded to the employees. But these are incentives that are specific to individual employees, oftentimes based upon their individual performance levels. Then there's a category he calls the non-specific incentives. These are things such as all employees feeling free from hostility, all employees benefiting from customary, comfortable practices in the workplace. So these are practices that apply to all employees. They are not different depending upon individual employee and individual employee performance. Herbert Simon, who is another major player in the public administration literature on a lot of different topics, also weighs in on the idea of incentives. And for Simon, I have to say it, Simon says that there are two different categories of incentives. There are employee incentives and there are employer incentives. Employee incentives are things such as compensation, enhancement in prestige, social opportunities, promotional opportunities. According to Simon, those are the types of incentives that will motivate employees. However, for employers, the primary incentive that motivates employers will be power and authority, enhancing the power and authority basis for those employers, for those supervisors, for those leaders and managers. This is very much in line with what McClellan said. And to be fair, Simon actually said it first, but this is very similar to what McClellan told us in the 1980s about those three different motivators: achievement, affiliation, and power and authority. It's the power and authority that usually applies to the employers, and it's more the achievement and sometimes the affiliation that applies more for employees. But to kind of put a finer point on this, one of the last theories I want to discuss with you tonight is Anthony Downs' theory of what he calls bureau ideologies. And in providing incentives to motivate employees, Anthony Downs tells us that we need to be aware of the type of employee that we are dealing with. The different types of employees, different types of ideologies will respond differently to different types of incentives, different types of motivators. So for Downs, he identifies for us his 5 different bureau ideologies or 5 different types of employees. He says in an organization, we can have climbers, conservers, zealots, advocates, and since he was writing in the 1960s, statesmen. According to Downs, climbers are your younger, more ambitious employees. So these are people who have not worked in the organization for a very long period of time. These are people who are motivated by being able to climb the organization ladder. So they are motivated by higher pay, higher promotional levels within the organization. They want to climb that organizational chart. So the incentives you provide to those individuals are any incentives that will help them enhance their current status in the organization. If you do not provide those types of incentives, and if you block a climber's path toward promotion, it's likely, according to Downs, that that climber will engage in jumping. And jumping is just when they move from this organization to another organization that will provide them with those paths toward promotion. So that's how you incentivize and motivate climbers. Then he says a second bureau ideology, a second type of employee is a conserver. Conservers are your more veteran employees. These are the employees who have been in the organization for a longer period of time. These are the employees who have already accumulated the perquisites of the office, the perks of the office. They are motivated by the status quo. They are motivated by the opportunity to maintain and hold on to all those benefits and all those perks that they have accumulated during their time in the organization. So that's how you motivate those conservers, through more of a focus on the status quo. Then he says the third ideology is a zealot. He said zealots are employees who are very passionate believers in a singular issue or a policy. So they are motivated by anything that will help the accomplishment of their goals in this issue or this policy. And so in order to motivate those zealots, you motivate them by focusing on that issue that they are very passionate about. Then the fourth type of employee is an advocate. Advocates are, as the name says, an advocate. They are a supporter of their department or their unit or their division. And so you motivate these advocates through incentives such as additional appropriations for their department, or allowing them the opportunity to hire new employees into their unit. And that's what will then motivate these advocates. In an academic setting, I spent 10 years as department chair, and I think a lot of my department chair colleagues fell into this advocate category, and that they were motivated by being given additional tenure lines, that they can go out and expand the size of their nucleus faculty, or they're motivated by being given control over their budgets, or by they're given the opportunity to generate additional revenue that they can use for faculty travel and student events, and however they want to use it within their departments. So those are advocates for their departments, their divisions, their units. And then you have what he called the statesmen. According to him, the statesmen or statespersons are people who are in it for the public interest. Their primary concern is the interests of the public over the interests of the organization or the interests of themselves as individuals. So these people are motivated if you can show them the connection between what they do on a daily basis, what the organization is doing, and how it is benefiting the general interests of the public at large. So the importance here is Downs is re-emphasizing this contextual nature of motivation, that in order to motivate our employees, to provide them with the incentives that they place a high valence level upon, you need to know the type of employee they are to know what they value in terms of these incentives and these motivators. So it gets us even farther away from the classical idea of the one-size-fits-all approach to running an organization. We as leaders need to take a much more nuanced approach, especially when we are motivating our employees in our public organizations. Another good person to read if you're really interested in motivation and the use of incentives and motivation is somebody by the name of James L. Perry. And James Perry has really devoted a large portion of his research to looking at this idea of public sector motivation and the importance of intrinsic motivators and intrinsic incentives on the motivation of public employees, as opposed to how we motivate private sector employees. So one of the ways he has done it is he has done it with a traditional type of survey with your Likert response categories of strongly agree, neither disagree nor disagree, disagree and strongly disagree, and provides them with these questionnaire items that relate to 4 different dimensions of what he considers to be public motivation. So public administrators are motivated by things such as their attraction to public affairs. They're motivated by their commitment to the public interest. They're motivated by their compassion for others. And they're motivated by their willingness to engage in self-sacrifice. So he says for that first dimension of public sector motivation, the attraction to public affairs, he will use questionnaires such as statements like, politics is a dirty word. This is a reverse one whereby if people agree with that, then that is a negative indicator for their attraction to politics and public affairs. The give and take of public policy making doesn't appeal to me. another reverse indicator of attraction to public affairs and to politics. I don't care much for politicians, another reverse type of item. But those are questionnaire items that he uses to measure someone's attraction to public affairs in terms of what motivates them as public employees. Then the second dimension of public motivation is commitment to the public interest. Another reverse one, it is hard to get me generally interested in what is going on in my community. I unselfishly contribute to my community. Meaningful public service is very important to me. I would prefer seeing public officials do what is best for the community, even if it harmed my interests. So here is public interest above private interest. I consider public service as a civic duty. Those are all indicators of a commitment to public interest. Then the third indicator of public motivation is compassion. A reversed one, I am rarely moved by the plight of the underprivileged. Most social programs are too vital to do without. It is difficult for me to contain my feelings when I see people in distress. To me, patriotism includes seeing to the welfare of others. I seldom think about the welfare of people whom I don't know personally. That's another reversed one, obviously. I am often reminded by daily events about how dependent we are on one another. I have little compassion for people in need who are unwilling to take the first step to help themselves. And then finally, another reverse item, there are few public programs I wholeheartedly support. And then the fourth dimension that he talks about in his writing is self-sacrifice. Making a difference in society means more to me than personal achievements. I believe in putting duty before oneself. Doing well financially is definitely more important to me than doing good deeds, reversed. Much of what I do is for a cause bigger than for myself. Serving citizens would give me a good feeling, even if no one paid me for it. I think we all want to get paid, but you get the idea with that one. I feel people should give back to society more than they get from it. I am one of those rare people who would risk personal loss to help someone else, and I am prepared to make enormous sacrifices for the good of society. The basic moral of the story, no pun intended, with the Perry research is that those four dimensions of motivation are basically what tend to motivate public employees as compared to perhaps in general the private sector. And so much of the motivators and incentives that we use in the public sector tend to be much more intrinsic in nature. I think, in my years of running an MPA program and reviewing applications to an MPA program, I see that come through loud and clear in a lot of the applications. In statements that students submit, the statements always talk about serving their communities and serving the public interest. And it's really those types of intrinsic incentives that I think really contribute much more to motivation in public organizations. But the whole idea here with our discussion of motivational theories is to kind of show you how we have taken this focus of human resources from the human resource management theorists, and we've used that information from people like Mayo and people like McGregor in order to inform how we can motivate people in our public organizations. And even though in public organizations we have much more stringent limitations on the types of incentives that we can use, there are still these theories and these still approaches that we can utilize in order to motivate our employees. And by motivating our employees, we can help them achieve higher performance levels, not just for them, but also to help us in terms of achieving effectiveness at a more macro level in our organizations. So the unifying theme here between human resource management school and motivation school is this focus on individual employees and the recognition that people have different wants, needs, and desires, and that organizations need to understand that. They need to differentiate between their employees in order to be effective as organizations. The models of organizational effectiveness that are emphasized by motivational theory are very similar to the ones in human resource management theory. Primarily, we're looking at human relations, internal process, and rational goal. In terms of mechanisms for coordination and control, again, similar to HRM, we are focusing on mutual adjustment. In terms of our methods for motivating employees, very much our job identification, and I think a little bit of goal congruence as well. Because as we talked about with Edwin Locke in goal setting theory, the more people believe in the goals of the organization, the more likely they are to be motivated to work toward achieving those goals of the organization. So any questions up to this point in time about what we've covered with our Human Resource Management School and our School of Motivation Theory? Any questions or observations on either of those two schools of thought? Then I think instead of doing the breakout groups, because we are after 8 o'clock now, I would just recommend that you think about your organization. As you think about your organization, try to identify some elements within your organization that you think reflect human resource management theory and motivational theories. So think about some of these theories we've talked about tonight and examples of those theories that you can find within your organization. By identifying those theories, that obviously is something that's going to help you out in your organizational analysis paper. So if you see elements of McGregor, you see elements of Mayo, you see elements of Argyris, you see elements of content-based or process-based motivational theories, those are the types of things I'd like for you to think about in relation to your organization. Because our whole goal in class, as I said before, is we're an organization theory class, but we're really trying to find that nexus, that connection between these sometimes abstract theories and then how they can apply within your organization. And so I think we'll forego the breakout group tonight and we'll just call it quits at this point. What this has done now is it's really set us up in terms of our discussion of the trajectory and evolution of the organization theory literature to move us up to the point in time where we can then move into a discussion of systems theory. So we won't have class next week, but in 2 weeks, when we get together, we'll start our discussion with a discussion of systems theory. We'll talk about the differences between natural closed and open systems theory. We'll talk about the importance of looking at organizations as part of a bigger existence, as part of a bigger whole. We'll spend the first part of that class in 2 weeks talking about systems theory. Then we'll move into what we consider to be the more modern organization theories. And that's when we'll get into a discussion of participative management, quality management, organization culture theory, and theories of leadership, and how leaders can have an impact upon the effectiveness of their organizations. Then when we're done with that information in 2 weeks, then I'll have kind of a wrap up where we'll kind of put a bow on all this information, and we'll talk about the themes that have kind of tied together our discussion of the evolution of the organization theory literature. And then if anyone is not going to be with us on July 3rd and they want to do their presentation on the 26th, then we'll also have a little bit of time left at the end of class to do at least a handful of presentations. And then on July 3rd, we'll reserve that entire session then to wrap up the remainder of our presentations. Okay? Sound good? All right, if there are no other questions or any observations, I will get this recording up onto our Canvas site no later than tomorrow morning. I wish you a very happy Juneteenth next week, and then I'll talk to you again in 2 weeks on the 26th, and we'll move onward through our discussion of the evolution of organization theory. Okay? Thanks, everyone. Have a great night. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you in 2 weeks. Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Professor.
you.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.